When I was accepted into the study abroad program, I imagined late-night study sessions, new friends, and exploring the city's historic streets. Instead, what I remember most vividly is the window in my dorm room. The room itself was ordinary: a narrow bed, a desk beneath a tall window, and a wardrobe that creaked every time I opened it. The window overlooked a quiet courtyard surrounded by old, ivy-covered walls. At night, the courtyard was lit only by a single orange lamp that flickered whenever the wind blew. My roommate, another exchange student, moved out a month after we arrived because he'd found a cheaper place off campus. That left me alone in the dorm. I didn't mind at first. I liked the solitude. It was easier to focus on my assignments. But after a few weeks, I began noticing something strange whenever I worked late at my desk. The window was large and old-fashioned, the kind with a wide wooden frame and slightly warped glass that distorted reflections. When it was dark outside, the pane usually reflected my face and the glow of my desk lamp. But sometimes I'd see something else in the glass. At first, it was subtle, just a suggestion of movement behind me, as if someone had passed by in the room. But when I turned around, the room was empty. One night, as I typed out an essay with my headphones in, I felt the faintest sense that I wasn't alone. I pulled off my headphones and glanced at the window. In the reflection, I thought I saw a figure standing just behind my chair, tall, indistinct, as if made of shadow. I spun around so fast that my chair nearly tipped over. There was no one there. I told myself it was a trick of the glass, maybe my own reflection distorted by the uneven surface. I even avoided looking at the window for the rest of the night. But over the next few days, it happened again. I'd catch a glimpse of that same shadowy outline, sometimes near the wardrobe, sometimes by the door, always in the reflection of the glass, never when I turned to look directly. One particularly cold night, I woke up around 3 a.m. because I heard a soft tapping. The room was dimly lit by the courtyard lamp outside. I sat up listening. The tapping came again, slow, deliberate, on the window pane right above my desk. The sound was light, almost hesitant, like the tip of a fingernail brushing the glass. Gathering my courage, I switched on the desk lamp and approached the window. Outside, the courtyard was still and empty. No branches reached the window, no birds or insects around. When I leaned closer to inspect the glass, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A faint smudge in the shape of a handprint, as if someone had pressed their palm against the outside of the pane. The handprint was too high to have been made by a passerby standing in the courtyard below. The next morning, when daylight filled the room, the handprint was gone. From then on, I kept the curtains drawn at night, but that didn't stop the sense that someone was standing just behind me whenever I worked at the desk. One weekend, I decided to rearrange the furniture so the desk no longer faced the window. I thought that if I couldn't see the glass, I wouldn't keep imagining things. But that night, as I sat in bed reading, I noticed something new. The reflection of the shadow was still visible, this time on the darkened glass of my wardrobe door. It was as if the shadow wasn't tied to the window at all, but to the room itself, always finding a way to be seen when there was a reflective surface nearby. The last week before winter break, I stayed up late packing. The courtyard outside was covered in frost, and the orange lamp flickered in the cold wind. I glanced at the window one final time and froze. A figure was standing in the courtyard, directly beneath the lamp, barely visible through the frost-blurred glass. It wasn't moving, just standing still, head slightly tilted as though looking up at my room. I couldn't make out any features, just the shape of a tall, thin person cloaked in darkness. I closed the curtains quickly and didn't sleep that night. When I returned after the break, I asked the dorm caretaker if anyone had access to the courtyard during the holidays. He shook his head and said the gates had been locked the whole time. I never saw the figure again after that winter, but I never left my curtains open at night for the rest of the semester. Even now, I sometimes catch myself glancing at dark windows, half expecting to see that faint silhouette looking back. When I signed up for my exchange program, I was thrilled about the new campus I'd get to explore. The university was housed in several historic buildings, with high ceilings, arched hallways, and study rooms that looked like something out of an old library. I was assigned a single dorm room on the third floor of one of the oldest residence halls. At first, it was perfect, quiet, close to the library, and near the campus gardens, but I soon realized that the building had an atmosphere. Most students avoided the far end of the third floor, where a narrow hallway led to a locked study room. The door was heavy oak, with a brass handle that had turned dull with age. There was a sign taped above the door that simply read, "Do not use maintenance." I assumed it was being renovated and didn't think much of it, at least at first. One evening, about 3 weeks into the semester, I stayed late at the library to finish an essay. By the time I got back, the dorm halls were quiet, and the sound of my footsteps echoed faintly. As I approached my room, I heard the soft scrape of wood, like a chair being moved, coming from the direction of the locked study room. I stopped and listened. The hallway was empty, and the lights above buzzed quietly, casting long shadows. A few seconds later, I heard it again, the faint creak of a chair leg dragging across the floor inside that locked room. I tried the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. The brass knob felt icy under my hand. Feeling uneasy, I hurried back to my room. I brushed it off, telling myself that the building probably creaked in odd ways because it was old. The next night, as I passed the same hallway on my way back from the showers, I caught a glimpse of movement in the small, rectangular glass pane at the top of the study room door. It looked like someone's shadow crossing the room. When I stopped to take a closer look, the room beyond was pitch black. I asked my roommate, a friend from my program, if anyone ever used that study room. He shook his head and said he'd never seen it open. A few days later, I stayed up late again, working on a project in my dorm room. At around 2 a.m., I decided to take a break and grab some water from the common kitchen down the hall. As I passed the locked study room, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. The lights inside were dim, flickering faintly as though a single bulb struggled to stay on. Curiosity got the better of me. I pushed the door open a little further. The room smelled faintly of old books and something like damp wood. It was empty, just a single table and a few old chairs stacked against the wall. I stepped inside to take a closer look. The air felt strangely heavy, and the flickering light made the shadows shift and stretch across the floor. Suddenly, I heard the soft scrape of a chair leg, though none of the chairs had moved. I backed out of the room quickly, pulling the door shut behind me. The next day, I told a few friends what I'd seen. One of them laughed it off and said I was probably imagining things after a long night of studying. But that night, as I lay in bed trying to sleep, I heard it again, the faint drag of a chair leg on wood. It wasn't coming from the hallway. It was coming from directly beneath my room, where the locked study room was. The sound came in intervals, as though someone was slowly pushing a chair back and forth, back and forth. I couldn't shake the unease I felt. I grabbed my phone and opened the Notes app, thinking I might record the times I heard the sound. But the moment I hit record, the noise stopped. The next few nights, it was the same, silence when I was alert, but as soon as I was on the verge of sleep, I'd hear the dragging again. One night, unable to ignore it anymore, I decided to confront it. I got out of bed quietly, put on my slippers, and stepped into the hallway. The corridor was still and dimly lit, the overhead light flickering near the study room. I approached slowly. The door was shut, but as I got closer, I noticed it wasn't fully closed. It was resting slightly open, just enough to show a thin sliver of the room beyond. I hesitated, then pushed it open gently. The chair that had been stacked against the wall was now pulled out to the center of the room, facing the doorway as if waiting for someone to sit in it. I didn't step inside. I couldn't. I slowly backed away, keeping my eyes on the chair until I was out of the room and back in the hallway. The next morning, when I checked again, the door was locked as usual and the chair was back in its place against the wall. I never went near that hallway at night again. Even now, I sometimes wonder if someone or something was still using that locked study room long after the university had abandoned it. When I first arrived as an exchange student, I was determined to keep up with my coursework. I spent a lot of time in the university library, an old, ivy-covered building that looked more like a museum than a place for studying. Most students avoided the upper floors after dark. The lights there were dim, and the hallways stretched so far that sound barely carried. But I liked the quiet. I often stayed late at a corner desk near the old history archives on the 3rd floor. One rainy Thursday evening, I lost track of time while working on a research paper. The main lights on the 1st floor went out at 10 p.m., a signal that closing time was approaching. I was still on the 3rd floor, surrounded by the tall shelves, when I realized how quiet it had become. I began to pack my bag, but then I noticed something odd. A faint beam of light glowing under the door of the restricted archives room across the aisle. That door had always been locked. I'd seen the padlock on it many times before. At first I assumed it was a staff member finishing up some cataloging. But as I stood there, I realized the light wasn't steady. It flickered, as if from a candle. I hesitated, then decided to head downstairs. When I turned toward the stairwell, I heard the soft thud of the archives door closing behind me. The sound echoed in the empty floor. I tried to convince myself it was just the building settling, but halfway down the stairs I heard slow, deliberate footsteps following me. They were measured, not rushed, not heavy, just a steady tread that matched my own pace. I stopped. The footsteps stopped. I turned and looked up the staircase behind me, but all I saw was the empty landing and the yellow glow of the wall light. I walked again, forcing myself not to hurry. The steps resumed. When I reached the 1st floor lobby, I expected to see the librarian at the desk, but the counter was empty. The whole lobby was dark except for the green glow of the exit sign. I went straight to the door and pushed. It didn't move. The library had been locked for the night. I checked my phone. 10:15 p.m. Closing time had already passed. The rain outside streaked the tall glass panes, making the night look even darker. I called the campus security number posted near the entrance. The line rang and rang before going to voicemail. I felt the faintest movement of air behind me, like someone walking past. I spun around, but the lobby was still empty. I decided to wait by the front door for the night guard to make his usual rounds. I sat on a bench beneath the notice board, watching the glass doors. The building creaked now and then, as if settling into the cold rain. Minutes passed. Then I heard it again, the footsteps. This time they weren't on the stairs, but on the tiled floor behind the information desk. Slow and steady, crossing from one side of the lobby to the other. I leaned forward to get a better look, but there was nothing there. I stayed absolutely still, barely breathing. The steps came closer, stopping just on the other side of the desk, hidden by the tall wooden counter. I whispered out loud, "Hello? Is someone there?" but got no reply. Instead, a drawer in the desk slid open by itself and slammed shut with a hollow clap that echoed through the lobby. I grabbed my backpack and moved to the far side of the bench, keeping my eyes on the desk. After a while, the air in the lobby felt colder, as though a draft had swept in. I checked the doors again, still locked. At exactly 10:45 p.m., the overhead lights near the exit flickered on for a few seconds, and I saw a tall shadow reflected in the glass of the front doors, standing just behind me, perfectly still. When I turned around, there was no one there. Moments later, I heard the jingle of keys and the lobby door opened. It was the night guard, startled to see me sitting there. I quickly explained I'd been locked inside. He looked uneasy when I mentioned the footsteps. He said the library's security system hadn't triggered any motion sensors after closing, which he found strange. I never stayed past dusk again. Even now, when I picture that faint shadow in the glass, I wonder if I was truly alone in the locked library that rainy night, or if someone, or something, was waiting for the last student to leave. When I first arrived for my study abroad semester, everything felt new and exciting. I was assigned to a student dormitory that was more than a century old, a tall brick building with arched windows and long, echoing hallways. The rooms were small but cozy, and I was grateful to have a space to myself. Most of my neighbors were friendly, and the first few weeks went by without anything unusual. But as the winter season arrived, the dorm began to feel strangely different after dark. The radiators clanged and hissed, and the old pipes made hollow noises that traveled through the walls. One late evening, after finishing a long day of classes, I stayed in the study lounge on the second floor to prepare for an exam. By the time I left, the lounge was empty and most of the hallway lights had been dimmed for the night. As I walked toward my room at the far end of the hall, I passed the old wooden staircase that led up to the unused fourth floor, a level the university had closed off for renovations. The door to the staircase was usually locked. That night, however, it was slightly ajar. I slowed my pace, curious but also unsettled. The light from the hallway barely reached the stairs, and the darkness beyond the door felt heavier than it should have been. I decided not to think too much of it and kept walking toward my room. As I slid my key into the lock, I heard a faint sound behind me, like someone whispering my name. I froze and turned, but the hallway was empty. At first, I blamed my tiredness and went inside, locking the door behind me. But as I sat at my desk, I could swear I heard the whispers again, faint, distant, coming from somewhere near the hallway outside. I pressed my ear to the door. The whispers were clearer now, though I couldn't make out the words. It was like several voices overlapping, soft and hushed, almost like students studying late at night. I peeked through the small peephole, but the hallway was deserted. I went back to bed and managed to fall asleep, convincing myself it was just my imagination. The next night, I stayed up late again, this time in my own room, reading by the desk lamp. Around midnight, I heard the whispers once more, but this time they sounded closer, just outside my door. A quiet shuffling sound followed, as if bare feet were moving along the carpeted hallway. I gathered my courage and opened the door. The corridor stretched out before me, silent and still. Then I heard the sound of slow breathing, coming from the direction of the staircase to the fourth floor. The door at the end of the hallway, the one that had been ajar the previous night, now stood fully open, though no light came from within. I stepped back into my room, closed the door, and locked it. I tried to focus on my reading, but the whispers continued off and on, sometimes louder, sometimes fading into the distance. The following day, I asked one of the older students about the fourth floor. He told me it had been closed for years due to water damage, and no one was supposed to go up there. He looked puzzled when I mentioned the open door. That night, I made a point of walking back to my room earlier, before the hallway lights were dimmed. Everything seemed normal at first. But just as I reached my room, I heard the whisper again, my own name, as if spoken by someone standing only a few feet behind me. I turned quickly. No one was there. I went straight inside and locked the door, keeping the desk lamp on as I lay in bed. Around 2 in the morning, I was awakened by a soft creaking sound, the unmistakable noise of a door opening slowly down the hall. I stayed still listening. The whispers rose again, this time clearer than ever, as if they were right outside my door. The words were indistinct but rhythmic, like someone reciting a verse. Then I heard footsteps moving away from my door, heading toward the staircase. The sound grew fainter until it faded completely. In the morning, I checked the hallway. The staircase door was shut and locked as usual, as if nothing had happened. I never heard the whispers during the day, only late at night, when the hallways were empty and the building seemed to hold its breath. For the rest of the semester, I avoided staying up past midnight, and I never walked near that staircase again. Even now, I sometimes wonder what was waiting on that locked fourth floor, and why. On some nights, it seemed to wander the halls looking for someone to listen.
I arrived from my semester abroad feeling excited but overwhelmed. The dormitory I was assigned to was a massive old brick building with 3 wings, forming a U-shape around a small courtyard. The walls inside smelled faintly of varnished wood and something older, the kind of scent that never quite goes away no matter how many times it's been cleaned. 2 of the wings were open for students. The 3rd wing, the farthest one down the hall, was sealed off. A heavy wooden door blocked the entrance, secured with a thick chain and an old padlock. Across it, wooden planks had been nailed in an X. A faded sign simply said, "No entry, closed, for renovation." My room was on the 2nd floor, just a few doors away from the staircase that led straight to that sealed wing. On the first night, I was too exhausted from traveling to care, but by the 2nd night, I started noticing things I couldn't explain. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up to the faint creak of footsteps just outside my door. The hallway floors were made of old wood that groaned under even the lightest steps. I assumed it was just another student coming back late from the library or a party. But the footsteps didn't stop outside my room. They kept going, slow and deliberate, down the hallway. Toward the chained door at the end of the wing, I waited for the sound of a key turning or the faint metallic jingle of the lock being undone. Instead, there was only silence. The footsteps faded as though the person had continued walking beyond the locked door, into the part of the building that wasn't supposed to be accessible. The next morning, I asked one of the dorm staff about it. She was an older woman who had been cleaning the hallway. When I mentioned hearing footsteps near the locked wing at night, she gave a quick laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes. "There's no way anyone got in there," she said. "The doors are chained shut, and no staff works overnight in that wing. Maybe it was just the building settling." I nodded, but her answer didn't feel convincing. Over the next few weeks, the strange sounds continued. I would sometimes wake around 2 or 3 a.m. to the faint shuffle of footsteps heading toward the sealed wing. Other nights, I heard soft whispers too faint to understand, coming from the direction of the wooden door. Once, I swore I heard the unmistakable thud of a heavy door shutting inside the sealed-off wing. Finally, curiosity got the better of me. One night, I tiptoed down the hall to the chained door and pressed my ear against the wood. At first, there was nothing. I almost convinced myself I was imagining it, until a faint whisper emerged from the other side. It wasn't in a language I understood, soft, rhythmic, like a chant or a lullaby. The voice sounded close, far too close. I felt my chest tighten, as if the whisperer were standing just inches away from my ear, separated only by the wooden door. I stumbled back and hurried to my room, locking my door and pulling the blanket over my head like a child. After that night, I started avoiding that staircase altogether. I'd take the long way around just to keep my distance. Still, no matter how far I stayed from that door, I could sometimes hear the slow, dragging footsteps passing my room in the dead of night, always heading toward the sealed-off wing.